In this video, I will go over the final project for the animation class. So the background is that you have now completed 3 major projects in the program, and you should now know your way around Adobe Animate. If you took good notes, you'll be in really good shape. Even if you didn't, you can always go to the profsteveg.wordpress.com site, go to the videos for the class, and just start looking around for whatever it is. Like, let's say you were doing a shape and you were having a hard time with the shape. Go back to the midterm, look through the table of contents in here and find the ones that start dealing with shape tweening. And you can also go back to your videos that you created, or your own animations that you created for all the projects, and look through them and see where things occurred, how you did them, and also they will give you an idea of where to go back to in the table of contents. The other thing that you will want to have before you start working on the final project is your Storyboard Plus project, the presentation from that, which is just your storyboards set one after another. But start working on a copy of that for your final project, so that when you're not animating and you're showing someone, you have those storyboards to fill in the gaps. And remember how to use F7 to make something disappear. So if you put a background in and you realize your background's covering up your storyboard frames, then all you have to do is go to the last frame of where you need your background and then just simply do an F7 and that'll make it disappear. And then when we're doing process checks over the final weeks of class, when we're not seeing animation, we'll still get the gist of where the story is going by seeing your storyboard frames. Okay, the requirements. The animation should be classroom appropriate, and it should make sense to general audiences. You really don't want to do an animation that requires a backstory, and if it does, then, and you really want to do it, then you should have some narration at the beginning that fills people in on what they're watching. Otherwise it just feels too campy and people lose interest very quickly. The animation will be completed in Adobe Animate using primarily vector graphics. So remember that bitmap images such as JPEGs, GIFs, and so on really slow down Animate. Heavy use of gradients will also slow down Animate. So if you do need one of these things, you know, like sometimes people will want to do an animation over a real photograph. So if you want to do that, just one photograph in there shouldn't be a problem. You know, keep it down to the minimum size that you get good quality for. Sometimes people like to use gradients, especially people who are familiar with Adobe Illustrator. You just don't want to use them on everything because it becomes the same for the computer resources as using photographs. The stage size will be 800 pixels in one direction by 800 or less pixels in the other direction. And I went over that in quite a bit of detail for the Storyboard and the Storyboard Plus projects. The frame rate will be 24 frames per second. The length of the animation will be 25 at the minimum to about, I usually don't recommend going over 90 seconds long, but if you're working towards the competition, just know that they have a minimum of 60 seconds long and a maximum of 3 minutes long. So you could go longer than 90, but I would have a very good reason for doing so. Otherwise, it's a lot of work for the judges to sit through a lot of long animations, especially if the length doesn't help the animation. The animation will include sound throughout. Typically, this is done with one or more musical tracks, as explained in the Storyboard Plus videos. Voice is also an option, and sound effects may also be used. If you only have 1 or 2 sound effects, though, that's not good enough. Then you should also have music. But if your animation is sound effect driven, like there's constantly sound effects, you could get by with just that, especially if it seemed like having music in there would be too much. Use of actions. When the Swift file is launched, it will launch stopped. The animation will contain a subtle interactive play button. So interactive meaning when you put the mouse over it, it changes states. Subtle meaning that if your animation doesn't contain bright saturated green and red, then neither should your play button. It should look like it belongs with the rest of the animation. And then same thing for the replay button. All actions will be on the top layer, and that layer will be either named A or actions. Proficiencies. The animation should follow the sound. A couple examples of that would include when a character, and I put characters in quotes because you don't have to have a character per se, like a person or a bunny rabbit. It could be a machine, a car, whatever it's all about though, should move according to the music. So an effective technique there would be to have movements such as footsteps on the beat of the music. What happens is your audience starts watching, and that really sucks them in because their foot starts tapping, and you've got a winner there. If you're using sound effects, they should obviously occur at the appropriate time. Another example would be a character's mouth moving to speech or voice. Music should fade in and out as appropriate, as discussed in the Storyboard Plus videos. The only exception to that would be a song that starts out naturally and or ends naturally. Otherwise, use fade in and fade out so we don't get any abrupt starts or stops. Animation should have a nice sense of flow and continuity to it. So it shouldn't be jerky unless that's part of this effect that you're after. But otherwise, it should look production, like I should say the production should have a sense of quality to it. Avoid an animation that starts out looking one way and then because you ran out of time looks another way. You've got to, obviously practice the discipline of time management and laying out your video with the frames and everything ahead of you so that you know what's going on is a great way to do that. And you don't have to start just at the beginning of your animation and work towards the end. You can jump around and work in the middle, work on a hard part of it first, and then save the easier stuff for last so that you know you're going to have time to pull off the harder parts. The animation will demonstrate proficiency with shape in classic tweening. If you choose to use sections of frame-by-frame animation, that's up to you, but just remember what we learned in class, and whenever possible, use shape tweens in classic tweenings. The animation should incorporate some of the following techniques. Now, it doesn't have to incorporate all of these, and incorporating all of them doesn't make it better per se. So it just is what's appropriate. So scale change, which can be accomplished both in scale change of characters, a big tall character, a small character, and then also zooming in and zooming out of things. Interesting transitions. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Playing with the viewer's perception, which can be done with transitions, and avoidance of the obvious. So if something comes in and happens very slow and methodically, and then something similar happens, it shouldn't happen at that same slow speed. Once people are getting used to what's going on, you want to change things up a little bit to keep your viewer interested. Talk a little bit more about transitions. Like a combination of a transition and playing with the viewer's perception would be this. You are very zoomed in at the beginning of a scene or the very beginning of an animation on, or you zoom into an orange on the breakfast table. The peel, the skin of an orange. We get so close to that, we're seeing all the little bumps and divots in the orange, and then all of a sudden you start to zoom out, and it's the stucco of an orange building in 2 towns over, that leads us to the next scene. Now, that's very commonplace now in movies and animations. So people are kind of expecting it, but the more you do it where you play with the viewer's perception and just make those transitions smooth is a real plus. One of the first movies, and it's still held in high regard as one of the best movies ever made, is called Citizen Kane. And if you're doing anything to do with, illustration or movies or animation, you should become familiar with this film, but not just watch it, like know what to watch it for? So here's a great article, 6 Ways to Citizen Kane Your Film, and it talks about some of the really interesting things that they did in this movie that weren't mainstream at the time they did them. And one of the key ones is the transitions. Both like in the way that I told you of, I think there's a scene where they zoom in on a window, and when they zoom out, it's the outside window of another scene. There's also a famous scene in here where they, let's see, which one is it here? It's the, well, I'll explain it to you, but I'll give you the link to this article as well. But the main character's sitting there in a chair, kind of, I think he's clapping to something that his wife said or whatever, but that fades into the clap of a crowd. A whole crowd is clapping in, you know, a whole different area, whole different set of characters. So in other words, an interesting transition. Part of the grade of your final project is a presentation. So what you will do is present your final animation, but you will, before you show us your final animation, you will show us one of the earlier animations from the class. Popular choices are the frame by frame project or the intro to the classic tweening project. Occasionally a student will even pick a part of the midterm to show because they use interesting characters, but that's totally up to you. File uploads for the final project will be 4 file uploads. You'll need the FLA and the SWF for the final project, and then the FLA and the SWF of one of the earlier projects that you are going to show. Name all projects starting with your last name, then underscore your first name and a description. And here's an example for Jane Doe right there for just the final FLA project. And then you should definitely check out some of the past work for students to look just for inspiration and to see the difference in the amount of work that goes into these. And I'm not saying like that the ones that have more simple characters were like less work or less effective, but just know that if you take on ones like, say, this one here or this one here, that is hours and hours and hours of work. Where if you keep it fairly simple, like this one's just basic shapes, this one is basic shapes that come together. This one is still pretty complex because of some of the facial expressions, but there's not a ton of stuff going on. Whenever you can use simple shapes, that's going to speed up your workflow, but it really, really depends on what type of look you are after, and then you just want to be consistent with that. And then also go to student awards on this website and scroll down, and anything that has a play button is past animation that has actually won awards. Of course, you want to familiarize yourself with the grading rubric so that you know specifically what things I'm looking for to be done and that are, you know, most likely to lose points if they are not completed. Other than that, you pretty much have all the knowledge you need now to work on the final project. And if you have problems with it, obviously ask for help and look back on the past videos, and I'll be happy to be looking at your work over the next few weeks.